Like, you show up to marathons now, and there's overweight people that are trained, that are fit, starting to carry fat. You can't reverse engineer this internal environment. If your body wants to store fat, it'll store fat because you set it up to do it. You know, like oh, how can you get fat from sugar? Well, read your goddamn anatomy book. It's no mystery. I was saying, you can't outsource this stuff to anybody. You can't outsource the function of your body to anybody. You have to grab hold of it and take care of it yourself and get the information. I'll tell you how I came to this. And I came to the high fat through, I was into long distance running. And I was particularly into ultramarathons. So about that time in early 2013, I'd completed, not all in 1 year, but in my running career, I'd completed 2 marathons of 85, 2 of 56, and that picture there was taken my last 85 kilometres in Mexico. Some of you might have heard of a book called Born to Run. Have you ever heard of? Anyway, if you're ever interested, it's a good yarn, but that race I ran in Mexico, where there's a book written about that whole story. But anyway, that's another story. This was before I sort of really got conscious about that, what I'm doing now. About a month after that marathon, that's when I heard about this fat for fuel. So, and this was one of the first books I read, called The Art and Science of Low Carbohydrate Performance. And Jeff Volek is one of the authors. You might, if you look him out on YouTube, he's all over YouTube. And his co-author is Dr. Stephen Finney, which is sort of, he's a bit like the father of this whole low carb ketosis thing. He sort of coined that term, nutritional ketosis. If anybody made that up, it was him. And what that refers to is basically maintaining ketones in your bloodstream, basically by your diet. So, and that obviously it's dietary fat, all those fats we talked about earlier, cream, coconut, butter, lard, all that good stuff. Goes to your liver, and out the other side comes ketones. And especially something like MCT, it's very good at producing ketones.
So how much do you recommend daily?
The MCT?
Yeah.
Okay, MCT is something you sort of got to find tolerant to, because it's some people get upset stomachs. I suppose it is. See, it is a refined product, and whenever you mess with the balance of something, which we've done, we've extracted certain fatty acids from another. You've taken something out of balance, which I don't even like to in the first place, but what I've read and looked up on this, I think it's very good. So you just got to find your own tolerance. I usually take about 2 tablespoons a day, so about 40 ml.
Yeah.
I have one in, and always on my food, have it with food.
Yeah.
Sometimes we actually blend it into coffee. You might have heard of the bulletproof coffee they make with butter and... so I'd never sort of just take it. It does. It's pretty good because it doesn't taste like anything.
I'll take it with apple cider vinegar.
Yeah. But yeah, I put it on my salad or whatever, but I put olive oil on. I mean, there's always oil all over my food, so... but yeah, I would just find your tolerance, and if you get a bit too much, then back it off a bit. So, but I'm looking into, actually, I think this one from Bioceuticals I mentioned, and even though it's a practitioner line, I've set up so we can probably get it through Govita and Mount Barker. They have naturopath work in there. So I can sort of tell you where to get stuff if you're interested. Because I think that one is better than... actually, I have them here.
Over the MCT, you reckon?
Yeah, because I don't want to get too much into it, but yeah, that's the one from that conference.
Yeah.
Bioceuticals ones.
They're usually quite expensive bioceuticals.
Yeah, and this is the one that's been on the shelf for many years. But the problem is, okay, MCT is a subcategory of just fat. You know, it's called medium chain triglycerides. So you've got short chain, you've got medium chain, you've got long chain. So when we classify them into these groups, MCTs are just the ones that make ketones the best. But then you look inside MCTs, and it's only certain ones of those that make ketones, right? So this one is like 65 to 70% are the ones that makes ketones, but this one is 95.
Oh.
So even though it's more expensive,
Yeah.
it's probably cheaper
Better
in the
value.
end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
But anyway, that's another, so that's a little bit on that. What these guys were saying in their book about fat for fuel was that basically you have a small sugar storage and a big fat storage, and you add those two up, that's your fuel tank. So can you see how you can actually, if you could run on fat, you could run a lot longer. Now this sort of, when I thought about, well, if I'm just running on that sugar when I'm running my 85 kilometres, I knew I had to take in calories during those 85. It took me somewhere between 8 and 9 hours to do that. And I had to eat something at some point. I thought, well, that would be pretty handy not to have to eat, So if I could start drawing on these fat reserves and they could, I'll just go back one slide. Can you see how if you're running and for your blood sugar to stay stable, you start drawing on your liver reserves, right? And that blood sugar would feed your brain. But can you also see that you store some in your muscles?
Mm.
But can you see how I haven't drawn a line from there to your blood sugar to your brain? And that's because, like I touched on earlier, the sugar we store in the muscles stays in the muscles and gets used in the muscles. So in fact, for the rest of our body, we've got very little sugar storage. Okay? I'll get on why that is. It stays in the muscle a bit later on. So you actually have a very, very small sugar storage for the brain during a long distance run. So by able to drawing on fat reserves, well, I could not only feed my heart and muscles, but also feed my brain ketones. I thought, geez, that'd be freaking handy. So I started looking at this and read that book, but it turned out when I looked at it, I had a bit of an advantage because 10 or 15 years ago, a neighbour of ours gave me this book, Nourishing Traditions. I don't know if you ever heard of it. By Sally Fallon. Very much about traditional cooking, traditional foods and whole foods, and I read about eggs, and this is what I read. I won't go through it all, but it basically said, high cholesterol food wrongly believed to cause coronary heart disease. So that was right up my alley.
My dad was only going to have one egg a week with his heart stuff.
Yeah. Because I was all about, how old was I then, I was late 20s or something like that. Anything controversial was great, And I didn't know what I know now. I hadn't read, but it was like that sounded pretty cool. Rich in just about every nutrient. So I thought, well, if I just eat enough eggs, I'll be okay. But that last bit, it maintains the integrity of the cell membrane. That sort of made sense to me somehow. I remember reading that. So from that point on, I started eating 30 to 40 eggs a week.
Wow.
And I pretty much kept that up. That's what I'd done. So I was already I was on a reasonably high fat diet because if you eat 6 eggs a day, it sort of limits what else you can eat. I love making my own bread and all that sort of stuff, and I also thought, well, I'm skinny because I'm running and this and that, So, but I read further about it, so that's when I started, okay, well, I'll try this. So that's what my diet would look like beforehand. It's not too bad, is it? So before reducing the carbohydrates and going high fat. But these are pretty much the food I started cutting out when I did that. So you see, I cut out something like beetroot. Pretty much anything that grows in the ground is going to be high sugar content, even though it's a vegetable. Not as bad as eating pure sugar, obviously, or fruit, but if you're trying to really reduce that carbohydrate, bread, obviously. There's sausages there. If sausages are processed, they usually have flour in them, and they might have other stuff in them as well. If you get pure meat sausages, fine. That's that little X here is potatoes under there, and that little dough that's honey. Okay, so there's actually a fair bit I cut out, and probably cut out those strawberries too.
So once again, it's not because you were overweight.
No.
This is not because you're overweight.
No, this was because this was the running that got me started. So that's basically what happens in a nutshell on low carbohydrate. You eat more fat, eat less carbs. So you're just changing those scales. but your protein pretty much stays the same. And this is where it gets a bad rap, you know, so you can't eat that much protein. But you don't really, even, in fact, I think you actually start eating less for different reasons. So, I made up something called my fat dish. I got, like, you can actually get smoked, I was living in Europe at the time, you can get smoked fat from the butcher. So I would put that into a wok with some ginger, throw in some other herbs, start sizzling that up. Then I would add greens like either spinach or kale or anything like that, and boil that right down. Then I'd top it up with heavy cream, pouring cream, and then I'd simmer that for an hour. And so you just got this highly dense super fat basically. Yeah. And, you know, I would have that for dinner with a couple of eggs. So that's my fat dish under there. A couple of eggs, some lightly roasted or raw vegetables, probably some raw carrot there, and just some sautéed beans. Sometimes I would get, that's actually raw meat. If I knew exactly where it was coming from, I would sometimes eat that. I wouldn't dare try that with anything from Woolworths or Coles. And that was my fat dish beside it. So you can see how my energy, but you saw how I made that fat dish. There's a fair bit of fibre and stuff in there, you know. So people got this idea, you just sit down and eat fat. Well, it's pretty much impossible. It's not palatable. So a high-fat diet is really, you know, to eat a lot of fat, you got to eat a lot of vegetables. Yeah. But basically, it's, you know, fat satiating, and once you're full, because it doesn't disrupt any signals, then it's very hard to, it's just like, oh, well, just gorge on that. Well, you can only eat so much. Yeah, and it's actually all because of hormone and body chemistry, what it does. Or it could be, you know, a fat dish, that's some fish and some raw carrots. And then dessert, have a little bowl like that with 8 fresh cherries and cream. So you can see how it's quite high fat and almost zero carbohydrates. So at the time, I was running up to 140 kilometres a week on my longest weeks. Probably less than 100 kilometres most weeks, but I was running a lot. You know, I would do things like run dragging a tyre.
Good on you.
You know, before breakfast for 3 hours.
It's your son.
Right?
Must be some good.
But see, before breakfast, right? So that takes a fair bit of energy.
So did I read that your dad was a runner?
My granddad. Oh, actually,
Granddad.
I'll get to that.
Yeah, this one.
I spent some time in New York. I would run around Manhattan Island before breakfast. It's about a marathon, just under, actually 40 point something, before breakfast, right? So I sort of had my first, what I call fat adapted race without measuring anything, but I could feel my running had never been better, basically. And
You're running in thongs. What are you running in?
yeah, well, that's almost another story in
What
itself.
is that?
Running sandals, but that I finished that half marathon in an hour 26. Now it's not world record breaking, but it's pretty decent, and especially I was just before I turned 40, and you know that was a race of 20,000 people, got me into the top 200. So it's sort of the top of the amateurs, if you know what I mean. If you just want to gauge, you know, performance against the general population. So obviously it's not the Olympics, but so even though my fat metabolism seemed to be working well for the running, which is basically it's working like that, we've seen that before. So I was eating this diet high in fat, and that's how I was getting my energy. You know, I was getting very little blood sugar made from the diet, but a lot of fatty acids and ketones made. So see how we talked about this before? Now I predominantly change, this is where my energy is coming from, rather than blood sugar and then the blood sugar feeding into the... Now blood sugar will feed into the muscles and heart as well, but because the brain can't run on anything but blood sugar, it's always going to be spared for that. And this is when you hear people about, oh, my metabolism slowed. Because if you can't make ketones and you start reducing your substrate, your diet, for blood sugar, and your brain can only run on that, and your body can't run without your brain, well, guess what? This is going to slow down. Yeah? Because we can slow this down and still stay alive, but we can't slow this down very much. So if you limit this source and you can't do all this, yeah, your body's just going to turn down what do you call when you say, I slowed my metabolism. That's what happens. So yeah, your body's very, very smart. It's always going to make you survive. So that was happening in me. But I was drawing inspiration from this guy, my grandfather. And that's a picture of him winning the Danish marathon in '54. You probably see I look a bit like him, and he looks a bit like my dad as well. 2 years before that, he was at the Olympic Games.
Wow.
And he happened to have a few issues with cramps and stuff, but he also came up with one of the legends. If you ever heard about this guy, Bill Satterpeck? Yeah, so he was pretty much broke every running record there was at that time from, I think he won the 5,000 metres as well. And then he went and won the marathon, so he was that freak. And the 10,000. And yeah, he's a pretty cool guy to read about actually. So he was in that, my grandfather's in there, but he actually got cramped during the race and had to stop and massage his legs. But anyway, his best time was 2:40:41. And that sort of became a goal for me. And that's sort of how I drew my inspiration to keep running. So in the meantime though, I was sort of starting to become this high-fat geek too. Reading everything. I'd only just sort of really discovered YouTube around then. I'm not a technical geek at all. I've never been interested in it, only for when I need to learn something. But I'm not fascinated by technology. Well, I'm not fascinated by I'm fascinated what I can use it for. So I was reading books and listening, to podcasts and not even podcasts, YouTube. And guess what? Around that time was just some of the research I was starting to listen to, they were only starting to come out back then. This is 2013. So it's still reasonably new. Like it's taking on, it's plowing ahead now. So I looked up, what is a geek in the dictionary. It's unfashioned, social-minded person or knowledgeable and excessive enthusiast, like a high-fat geek. Well, I put that high-fat geek in there. It could be a computer geek, I think it said. Anyway, one of the books I read was Grain Brain, written by Dr. Perlmutter. That's him and his wife there. I believe they're in Corsica. I just stole that off his Facebook page. But he's a neurologist, so he's very interested in how diet affects the nerve tissue. And it turns out when you read his book that something like ketones actually like a super fuel for the brain. And we talked about why I couldn't sleep through my fast. So all this was starting to make sense now. I read this and then I read that and listened to this guy and then I went and did it and that's something Dr. Perlmutter said in his book, So it was sort of starting to all make sense for me. And he's since written more books, but one called Brain Maker, which I highly recommend, because the cornerstone of what he does is still a low-carb, high-fat diet. And I met him in 2013 for the first time at his house in Florida, and he wrote about me on his website. That article is actually still, if you go to his website, it's still up there. How I was doing this long distance running on a low carb, high fat diet. And the reason I was actually there at his house and he wrote this was because I was there to interview him. I had some friends in the film industry and they thought it was pretty cool, this quest I was on to chase my grandfather's time. So the movie was going to be called 2:40:41. Unfortunately, as is sometimes in life, that movie never eventuated. I'll get back to why that was. But before that, we interviewed Dr. Perlmutter. We'd done some other filming at a university. So I'm going to talk about that after. To get this trailer made, which we're going to do a crowdfunding campaign. But it sort of explains quite well what I was doing. So I've got it here for you. So it's just 3 minutes, so I'll let you watch that.
good.
Fat is your friend. You get into a state that's called ketosis.
Good, good, good. Keep it up.
Everything looks great, Olaf. Just keep pushing through.
Excellent.
You can take this to the bank. Olaf's going to validate the whole notion of a high-fat, low-carb, ketogenic type of diet.
In 1952, my grandfather qualified for the Olympic marathon. He did it in a time of 2 hours, 40 minutes and 41 seconds. Now, I'm on a quest to match his time and hopefully break it.
Now, back in 1992, the US government issued a doctrine that we should all be low-fat or no-fat. And within 10 years, rates of diabetes in America went up threefold. Doctors have been telling you for years that you've got to cut out the fat. Absolutely nonsense. Olaf has adopted this incredibly powerful lifestyle and dietary program, really mimicking what humans have eaten for a couple million years. And when you look at the metrics, as demonstrated from his work up at the University of Florida, it's over-the-top breathtaking. He's got this incredible physiology now, really based upon this dietary shift away from carbohydrates and favoring dietary fat.
Everything lands or loads very nicely.
Very efficient running. Your metabolism looks great.
Okay.
3, 2, 1, and let's bring you down. Okay, he's hanging on.
How hard were you working at? Yeah, how hard were you?
Olaf has done a great job with his conditioning and his nutrition. Your maximum heart rate was 192. You've got perfect heart, no indication of any heart disease whatsoever.
You exceeded 70, which is quite astounding. That's fantastic.
For 99.9% of our time on this planet, we didn't have sources of carbohydrates. People say, well, give us this day our daily bread. It's in the Bible. We've always had bread. Not true.
What really surprised me is how long you were able to hang on to using fat for fuel.
We know that Olaf's eating a lot of eggs, 30 to 40 eggs per week. Eggs contain saturated fat. We've all been told to avoid saturated fat, and nothing could be worse for us. We desperately need saturated fat.
Thank you for watching my short film, and I'd really be excited if you could help me finish this project.
Take the sugars and carbs out of the human diet, revisit the idea that we need fat, and we'll once again experience good health.
So yeah, that was going to be a trailer for a crowdfunding campaign. Unfortunately, I stopped running, so that was a bit of a problem. I'll get to why that was, but as I said, I was in Sydney recently, where Dr Perlmutter is a keynote speaker at a 3-day conference, and he agreed to do a short interview with me, which we did, and I'll have that up on my site within probably a week or so. I was supposed to have about 40 minutes with him. I got about 10, so he pretty much talked to me, and then he ran straight on up onto the stage. But he's a really cool guy, and definitely I think one of the thought leaders in the world of how the body works. I kid you not, anybody from the street could have walked in and sat through his presentations and understood that. That's how good a communicator he is, and brings it down, and yeah, so I really admire the guy, and he still wants to stay in contact and work, so and help me promote myself. So, and he's starting. I mean, he's been on every TV channel, Fox News, Dr. Ross, all that sort of stuff, and so. But anyway, 2 weeks earlier, before we interviewed him at his house, we were just up the road, the University of Florida, in Gainesville, where we filmed my VO2 max test. And that was, you might remember seeing this in the movie. I was hooked up running on this treadmill with all these gadgets attached to me and a big mask. What that test does, it pretty much, they put you on a treadmill, and you start very low effort, and then they just keep putting the speed and the incline up, and you basically go till you can't go anymore. So there's no end until you basically stop yourself. And what it does, it measures a myriad of things, but it mainly, the big thing is it measures your ability to take in oxygen and distribute that into your tissues. So it measures basically, it is one of the biggest things for how well your body works. Now, if you go into a chart, the general population, and you see my age group 40 to 49, superiors, if you're above 48, you're like in a high category. Mine was 70, it's even hit 71 unofficially. So I was up there with Olympic athletes in capacity. I'm not saying skill, this is just the physiological. Doesn't mean that you can go and be a world-class performer, but it does mean I have a physiology that matches theirs. I said, I just turned 40, and they go, what are you doing? Now, what I haven't got on here is that they also measure, that mask can measure what you burn for fuel. And I was standing still on that treadmill, and there's 3 doctors in the room, and the one watching the screen, she just goes, holy shit, you're burning 100% fat standing still. They'd never seen that either. So it's just like, we want to bottle your metabolism, you know. And then I had this test, and they go, where did you come from? Because it's like a human performance testing centre. So they test a lot of athletes. So, you know, for a 40-year-old amateur athlete, it looked like my heart, my lungs were, and my whole body was working very well. Now, did you see this guy talking on the video? Anybody know why he's looking at that screen during my test? Any ideas?
Heart rate or something?
Yes, he's keeping a close eye on my heart.
In case you arrest.
Well, it's a stress. It's also known as a stress test. You're basically seeing what your body's capable of, and they measure a few metrics. So pretty much every minute, he's got to allow the test to go on, and so he's just glued to that screen. That's why there's 3 in the room. There's the girl talking to me and taking my blood pressure, and there's another girl over here asking me other questions, and you point to charts. It's a very, very close monitored thing. Because they know that they're taking you as far as you can take your go, and you know, if you're crazy enough, you can. That's why they monitor. If something's going wrong, they cut it, right? So he was glued to that. That's what all those gadgets are for, measuring all your heart rate and all this other stuff. My maximum heart rate reached 192, which for my age, I should have reached about 180. So it meant I still had a fair bit of capacity in my heart, even though that declines as we get older. So that was like the heart of a 28-year-old, I suppose. This is just a guide. I mean, it's a rough guide, but this is what again, the general population. So Kevin's exact words, as you might have heard him say on the video, all of us got a perfect heart, no sign of any heart disease whatsoever. That's a pretty accurate measurement. You know, it doesn't get much better than that for measuring how your heart works. But after we finished filming that day, he goes, oh, there's something else I want to show you. So I go, whoa. And he pulls out this chart that looks like that. And he explains to me what he's looking for. He said, well, okay, I look for, this is when the heart opens, and this is when it closes, and, you know, I'm looking, this is not my chart, this is just one I pulled off the internet, because I haven't actually got my chart. But he said, what I look for is irregularity. And if there's too much irregularity, then we stop the test. Okay, I get that, yeah. And he says, look, there's a certain amount of, he says some irregularity is quite normal, but that's why you have to have somebody there monitoring it. But he said, but your heart did not even show one. He said it was like textbook perfect, like he'd never ever seen that. And that's what the guy does. So he said, well, what are you doing? You're burning 100% fat. You know, you got a VO2 max of 70 at 40, which is partly genetic as well, by the way. And you got this heart that just runs.
Perfect.
So they were quite excited about, whoa, you know, yes, we want to be part of this project, you know, and see where this leads. But anyway, so in summary, what they told me at a highly respected university was that, you know, my VO2 was 70, my heart rate, maximum heart rate was 192, I had a perfect heart with no irregularities. It's a quite nice thing being told when you're 40. And that was despite, you know, eating 30 to 40 of these a week, high in saturated fat for the past 10 or 15 years. Now you asked about cholesterol and fat before and how we're all scared of it. Well, so the hypothesis which states that we all abide by today. By the way, anybody know what a hypothesis is? We hear it sort of thing, and I don't want to look everything up and I don't know. Well, it's a hypothesis is a proposed explanation. Right? So this is the hypothesis of heart disease today. Is the official statement from the Heart Foundation is, you can go on the website, I did this yesterday, cholesterol clogs our blood vessels and gives us heart disease. Now that's my words, but if you go onto the website, you can see it here. Diet. Eating foods high in saturated fat and trans fat makes your blood cholesterol level go up. So not saying saturated fat clogs your arteries, but it says it makes cholesterol, which then clogs your arteries. When there's too much cholesterol in your blood, it builds up in the walls of your arteries. Your arteries become narrowed and blood flow to the heart is slowed down or blocked. You may suffer chest pain or heart attack. Yep. So they're basically saying that saturated fat clogs your arteries because it makes too much cholesterol. But that statement seems to conflict with the scientific method, according to this university. Now the scientific method, again we looked that up, a method of procedure that has characterized natural science since 17th century, consisting in systematic observation, measurement and experiment, and the formulation, testing and modification of hypotheses. Would this qualify as a scientific method? Do you think? You can't get much more, you know, a procedure. It's systematic. They're observing me. They're measuring me. It's an experiment. And it's testing. So I would say that there's the scientific message, as good as you get. But the point I'm just trying to make is that the scientific method is the procedure how we proceed with science, how we should look at things in all these keyword ways, you know. It's not just, oh, I just think that. Or somebody said, that's not science. This is the scientific method according to the damn Oxford Dictionary. And you can't outsource this stuff to anybody. You can't outsource the function of your body to anybody. You have to grab hold of it and take care of yourself and get the information. You know, even me, I'm just a starting point for you guys, hopefully. You know, don't take anything I say at face. You know, I'm trying to sort of break it down to what I believe works. But still, I'm just saying stuff, you know. But remember, going back to what I was doing, remember what a VO2 max test, it measures specifically that number, your ability to take in oxygen and use it. Not just take it in, but get it to your tissues. And wouldn't you think that would require unclogged arteries? It has to, right? I don't know how you get a lot of blood through that. And I said mine was up there, I had high capacity. So there's really no way I could have this. It was impossible. Otherwise I wouldn't have the VO2 max 70. So they can't both be right. So it seemed to conflict that cholesterol clogs our blood vessels with my VO2 when I was eating that many eggs. Now to be fair, you go on the Heart Foundation's website and they do say some nice things about eggs. Don't need to worry about eggs and cholesterol. Eggs are very nutritious. That's what they do say, in all fairness. But the last line, so you can enjoy up to 6 eggs each week. Now, I was having 5 or 6 times that for 10 or 15 years, mind you. Now, but you sort of forget, we just focus on the eggs, but what about, I was eating this. You saw my fat dish, yeah? That was all high saturated fat. And I've been doing that hard for about 6 months before that. So, I mean, my arteries should be starting to clog up, shouldn't they? And yet, how could I have all that, all those good numbers, and that at the same time? It can't. Now remember also that Kevin said about my heart again. Got a perfect heart, no sign of any heart disease whatsoever. Conflicts again. And not even one irregularity. So what the Heart Foundation says and what Kevin says seem to conflict too. Now I know who I'm going to believe. So can you see why I'm very skeptical and why I'm not fat phobic? Because I have proven to myself that this is not an issue. I think they're beneficial. Right? I think we're actually going backwards by not eating fat. So that's one of the reasons I'm way beyond fat phobia, and I can even say it's because of science, and science tested on myself. But I am still just a study of one. Just remember that, okay? Don't let me get too carried away. So we're going to talk about something a little bit that we talked about in the break, and that's insulin sensitivity. Why is that important? Or insulin, what does insulin do? Hormone? Anybody know?
It opens the doors for the blood glucose to get into our cells.
Yes. It controls our blood sugar, basically. Blood sugar comes into our blood. We can't have it too high because that's toxic, but we also need it to go into the cells for energy. And insulin is the hormone that makes that happen. So here's my anatomy chart again. So you have a food source that makes blood sugar. It starts to rise in the bloodstream, and then depending on how much it rises, your body starts to secrete insulin. And that insulin will push the sugar into your cells. Okay? The more sugar it rises, the more insulin it releases, and it should work something like this. So it should control your blood sugar, and it should just keep pushing that sugar into the cells, so it only rises to a certain point. Does that make sense? So that's your muscle and organ cells and fat cells. Okay? So if you have very insulin sensitive cells, it means that glucose can get easily into your cells. Get out of the blood the way it should, go into your cells for energy. And it looks a bit like this. Can you see how it's a little bit thinner going into your fat cells? Because if your body's working properly, then that's going in to get used up in your muscles and organs for energy. And you only store whatever's left over. Now the way it's stored in the fat cells is that if there's excess blood sugar, it'll go to your liver, go through your liver, come out the other side as fat, and then go and get stored in your fat cells. So you can see how it's also how we become fat from sugar. That's actually the process right there in a nutshell. Excess sugar in the blood will get made into fat. Has to get out of the bloodstream. Very, very simple. And again, it's basic anatomy. You know, like we say, oh, how can you get fat from sugar? Well, read a goddamn anatomy book. It's no mystery. So, can you see why it's quite good to remain insulin sensitive for our health and weight? Because then it controls our blood sugar and it pushes that sugar into the cells. But if we start to go the other way, what happens then? We start to become resistant to insulin. We then have a food source that produces blood sugar. You can see how those muscle and organ cells, I've sort of indicated that with red, that's the resistance. Now there's sort of a thinner line going in there than there is going into the fat cells, yeah? And can you see how it says a sensitive fat cell? So we can actually become resistant to insulin in our muscle cells and organ cells, and yet the fat cells remain sensitive. So they can just dispose of all the excess glucose. So that's why we can actually be starving and get fat at the same time. So you can sort of think of this as fuel partitioning. Yeah? We're actually starving because you can't get energy into your cells. Because when you eat, it's just partitioned not in proportion. And we can sort of just look how that problem amplifies. And you actually start to see, I've illustrated that, see how that red cell is starting to shrink and this one's starting to grow? That's what's happening. We're actually starving on the inside, even though becoming bigger. And that'll just keep getting worse. So you wouldn't sort of think of somebody that's obese that they're actually starving. But the body's starving, just all that food is just getting locked away and stays locked away. So can you see how no matter how much you freaking exercise, if you can't release this, it doesn't matter. You're actually just stressing your body even more. You're stressing all these cells that I suppose you exercise with, which can't get enough energy to start with. But that's what we're told. You're just lazy. It's got nothing to do with being lazy. Nothing. And this is pretty much what happens if we look at my chart again. See how there's very little glucose being able to get into the resistant muscle and organ cells, but the fat cells are staying sensitive, so that glucose is getting converted and just kept pushed into the fat cells. And this problem just amplifies. What do we call this when we're resistant to insulin? We've got type 2 diabetes, haven't we? Yeah. We have an epidemic of it. And that's because that's what's happening. Fat cells are remaining sensitive. And there's actually a word for that today. Diabesity. Diabetic and obese, they usually go together. Not necessarily, but very, very often. It's the same mechanism. So we sort of, I heard the other day, it's one of the only things that are still allowed to do in society is laugh at fat people. But would you laugh at somebody with cancer? We wouldn't, would you? This is the freaking same. It's a dysregulation. And yet, the crazy advice we're told, oh, you're just lazy. Anyway. So what about if we get resistant fat cells as well? What do we have then? Would we have type 2 diabetes? So now the sugar can't go into your muscle cells or your organ cells or your fat cells. We still have type 2 diabetes, don't we? But now we've got it in slim people. You can get sugar out of your body in other ways. So this is why if you're slim, you're not necessarily functioning well. You're just not getting fat from the sugar. But you're certainly doing other damage. And this is starting to come back to why I stopped running. Remember these guys, Steve and Jeff? They wrote that book.
I've got a spare one. I bought two if anyone wants my second one. You're welcome to it.
Well, in that, when I was becoming geeky, I read how they actually tested marathon runners before and after. And they found that there was a pattern of marathon runners becoming insulin resistant. Actually, the damage from prolonged exercise. I thought, hang on, marathon runners, and I'm running ultra marathons?
Mm-hmm. What's what happened to Tim Noakes, isn't it? He talks about it, and he was a marathon runner.
Yep.
And ran right until he was 60, and then went crashing into type 2 diabetes. He'd never been overweight, and he was like a doctor, marathon runner, yada yada.
Yeah, but he's actually he says he's probably also got a genetic disorder where you are naturally. This is what we talk about genetics. You can have this to a certain degree from just by blame your mum and dad. And then, or you could be born over here, and you have to be born with that. So that's a genetic difference maybe to start with. But then if you amplify that, if you're born over here, where are you going to go from here? You might already have, by doing nothing, you might have a very, very low tolerance of carbohydrates because you can't use insulin very well. So, how do you think I was going? What do you think I thought when I thought, well, hang on, ultra marathons, what's that going to do to my... I've always been on about looking after my body first, so that was part of the reason I stopped running as well. So it's pretty hard to make a movie about running if you sort of quit running. But just keep in mind that I didn't quit because I had anything wrong. I've just been told I was in the best shape of my life. In fact, I was well above the average. So this was anticipation of what could happen in the future. And that's about 2.5 years ago. So the numbers I showed you when we first started today, that was my statistics back then, and these are my statistics now. And you see I dropped about 1/3 of the fat I had on my body compared to when I was in the best shape of my life. How does that work? And I'm not running, I'm doing bugger all exercise, okay? If I'd shown you this scenario instead, wouldn't that have made more sense? If we switch the numbers over? Yeah, I gained a bit of fat, not much. Still okay, but that's sort of what you would expect, not the other way around.
It generally happens with athletes, doesn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just go to lard, don't
Yeah,
they? You see
particularly
so
cricketers and
many
all that
of
sort of
them.
stuff.
But you start to see a picture here that if you have the wrong diet as an athlete, yes, you might be able to suck some of that glucose in because you still got some insulin sensitivity. But because the constant exercise will damage you, and then when you stop, you might have done so much damage, and that's just when it catches up to you. And no matter how much you keep exercising or don't. And now you say, well, why don't I eat less? Well, now you're starting to get partitioned into your fat cells. So actually your muscles and everything else is not getting any more energy than it did before. It's just it's getting partitioned because you messed up the internal environment.
How would you say, for instance, say footballers,
Yep.
what would you suggest to them? Because they do a lot of running and
Yes.
all that sort of stuff.
Get your diet in order. That's what produces the look at almost exercise is irrelevant. Whether you exercise or not, the diet is going to do what it's going to do. It's like you can't exercise your way out of a bad diet. It almost doesn't matter. I'm going to talk about exercise at the end, how I think it does matter. But if you're doing that damage, say, if you're becoming insulin resistant by eating too many carbohydrates, then it doesn't matter whether you exercise or not. It's still going to do the damage. Like you show up to marathons now, and there's overweight people that are trained, that are fit, starting to carry fat. You can't reverse engineer this internal environment. If your body wants to store fat, it'll store fat because you set it up to do it. Exercise just consumes whatever energy your body makes from the food you eat. But if it's storing half of that food and only releasing half of it, and I'll up my exercise, well, it's still stored. No matter how much you exercise, it's still going to store half the food you eat, or whatever percentage. So you got to get your diet in order and create that internal body chemistry, so that when you go and exercise, you've got all that energy available, and nothing gets stored as fat. Yeah, but can you see it's all to do with hormones, especially insulin. Yeah, there's other hormones. That's just like the big daddy of it, but it's the same principle. So, you see, I dropped 1/3 of my fat, 2.5 kilos. Then I was long distance running, more than 15 hours a week. Now I'm doing high intensity training less than 1 hour per week. So it's completely opposite of what we think. So what is going on? Now we sort of answered all these questions when we go through them anyway. But remember how Dr. Perlmutter said right at the end, take the sugars and carbs out of the human diet and we'll once again experience good health, his last line. Now why he said that is because sugars and carbs make your blood sugar go up, and we just talked about insulin, and then all this good stuff happens. So that's why he's saying that. So what are we talking about? Sugar? We're talking about all this good stuff. That's what's going to make your blood sugar rise the quickest and put the most pressure on your insulin. And if you release that much insulin for too long, you're going to become resistant. That's basically what happens. So you can be resistant from, via your genetics, or if you just keep pumping this sort of stuff into your body, that's going to your body's going to have to release so much insulin to take that out of your bloodstream that the cells become resistant to your insulin. Does that make sense? Really, when we think about it, this is the crazy stuff today. So what do we do? What do we give type 2 diabetics? We give them more insulin, don't we? But you've got to ask, well, why did that cell become insulin resistant? It can't handle any more blood sugar. the blood sugar is making it sick. It's messing up the cell inside, so it puts a protective mechanism. So it's actually telling us something, and we go, well, we just got to keep eating this sort of shit, and we're going to put some insulin in, and we're going to keep forcing that in. That's what's going on. So we cut out that crap, that's going to help a bit. But we don't sort of think too much about this, do we? That's pure carbohydrate and sugar as well. Once you eat this stuff, rice, pasta, bread and potatoes, that becomes sugar in your bloodstream. So it's just as important to cut that out because that's usually the bulk of our diet.
Wow.
Yeah? So if blood sugar and insulin is how we get fat, by it going up too high, then bringing those two down must be how we lose fat. Now the thing about a low carb, high fat diet, that'll keep that in check. Because once you cut out the carbs out of your diet, it's going to keep your blood sugar in check. And that's going to keep your insulin in check. And you're going to start to reverse insulin resistant, as it's now starting to show. So the reason we want insulin sensitivity is so we can control our blood sugar. And the low carb, high fat food source seem to do that rather well. Everybody happy with that? Anybody understand? We jump back and forth a bit, but it's can you see how it's body chemistry, it's hormones?
When you're saying cutting out sugars,
Mm-hmm.
fruit is high in sugar. Do you sort of advocate cutting out a lot of fruits as well?
Yes.
I
You
noticed
probably
had the
even,
orange and
yeah, I
red.
had,
Yeah.
I forgot, yeah, I had fruit juice.
Yeah.
This does exactly the same to your blood sugar as that.
Yeah. But the actual fruit itself?
It depends on where you're at. I eat very little fruit, but strawberry season's been on. I have strawberries at night. Berries seem to be the ones that you have heard the glycemic index?
Yeah.
That's basically where you can take carbohydrate foods. They might have the same carbohydrates, but they don't have the same influence on your blood sugar. And then that's individual in whatever you can handle too. So something like berries is usually lower glycemic, even though they have got a fair bit of carbohydrate.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, fruit juice is
Depending
just
on
like,
where you are on your...
it's just pure sugar. Also because you've just taken the sugar and thrown away the fibre.
Yeah.
You know, if you got 5 oranges in a glass, you'd never sit down and eat 5 oranges. So.